So in our last video, we talked about the key founder and investor protections found in shareholders agreements. In this video, we'll talk about the key protections found in articles of association, including the class of rights, preemption rights, and dragalong and tagalong rights. So let's start with classes of shares.
Right, so one of the key points that you'll have to look out for in the articles is whether there are different classes of shares. For founders, you'll tend to want all of the shareholders to have the same class as you, so ordinary shares. So everyone is equal with regards to, return of capital, dividends, voting rights. And if you're an angel investor, in order to benefit from the SEIS and EIS tax reliefs, you can't have any preferential rights you can't have any preferential economic rights. So again, you're typically going to be investing for ordinary shares. However, if you're not looking for that SEIS and EIS tax relief, so for example, if you're getting investment from a VC, then they might look to have a different class of share that has preferential rights. So typically this will be preferential rights on return of capital or on a liquidation. So essentially they're able to get their money out first. And that's in order to protect them from their downside risks. So in the same way that angel investors have SEIS and EIS tax relief to protect them from their downside risk, VCs will look for preference shares in order to protect their downside risk. So the key things to think about if you're a founder is, firstly, is an investor asking for a different class of shares? And secondly, what are going to be the rights that attach to those shares?
So another point to look out for in the articles is preemption rights. So preemption rights are essentially a shareholder's right of first refusal over the issue or transfer of shares. So preemption rights on share issue, how that would work is that before newer shares are issued, these shares must be offered to the existing shareholders, usually pro-rata to their current shareholding, before they are offered to any third parties. So this acts as a sort of anti-dilution mechanism for the shareholders, and that means that they can maintain their shareholding in exchange for investing more money into the company. So shareholders have a statutory preemption right on the issue of ordinary shares unless these have been specifically excluded from the company's articles. Founders will often exclude these statutory preemption rights, but they will offer modified preemption rights. An example of how this is modified is that these will there'll be a carve-out usually for the issue of shares under employee option schemes. So for investors, they would want to have preemption rights so they can maintain their shareholding. And for founders, they want to make sure that not every share issue would be subject to these preemption rights.
So the other preemption right that you'll come across is preemption rights on transfers. And that works very similar to preemption rights on allotment. It means that before shares can be transferred to a third party, that they're offered to the existing shareholders in proportion to their current shareholding. So if you're a founder, you're going to want to make sure that preemption rights on transfers are included in the articles, because you want to make sure that there is some structure around the transfer of shares in your company, including with regards to pricing. And as a founder, what you might also want to think about is including a provision which allows those shares to be offered to the company first before they're offered to the other shareholders. So, first it's offered to the company, then to the other shareholders before they can then be transferred to a third party. But if you're a founder or an investor, you do want to make sure that there's a carve out from that preemption right process in respect of transfers to permitted transferees. So permitted transferees will be people like family members or family trusts, because you may want to be, transferring your shares as part of your tax planning or your inheritance planning, for example. So, and if you're a founder, one thing to think about is whether you also want to include as a permitted transfers between founders to ensure that a certain proportion is maintained, a certain proportion of the shareholding is maintained with the founders. So for both founders and investors, you want to look out for the preemption rights, how that works, and then also whether the permitted transfers have been included.
Yeah, you'd usually find dragalong rights and tagalong rights in the company's articles. So dragalong rights are where the majority shareholders, which usually include the founders, have the right to, when looking to sell their shares, to force the minority shareholders, which usually includes the investors, to also sell their shares. So founders will look to include dragalong rights, as when it comes to selling a business, if they have a buyer who wants to buy the whole business, they want to make sure that the minority shareholders won't be able to block the sale. So dragalong rights are more protection for the founders or majority shareholders. So the protection for the minority shareholders, which are usually the investors, will be the tagalong rights. And these are where the minority shareholder can force the majority shareholder looking to sell their shares to also get an offer for the minority shareholders' shares too, which allows them to participate if there is a partial exit. So where the majority shareholders are looking to leave the company, the minority shareholders may not want to stay in the company too, so they want the option to go with them.
So one of the other key provisions that you find in the Articles of Association, which we haven't talked about yet, are leaver provisions. But there's so much to talk about around leaver provisions that we are going to save that for our next video.